Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and today I'm thrilled to be talking about the movie Kiss of the Spider Woman with writer and director Bill Condon. And in starting out, I was really fascinated by the way that you kind of approach thinking about the script, because ultimately when you break it down, you have 80 minutes that is a story very much set within this prison cell, and then you have 40 minutes that's a really extravagant musical. And I know that you were thinking about it both in terms of the tone of both of those stories, but also economically in terms of budget, you know, allowing to have a little bit more budget to accomplish the musical numbers and be more economical with the prison scenes. And so I was really interested in how the idea of breaking down to those two different spaces really shaped the way that you wrote this.
Yes, I sat down and wrote this on spec, and you always have to think, well, how are you going to get it made? And because it is, I keep describing it as a unicorn of a movie, it was never going to be something that had the budget of Beauty and the Beast or Dreamgirls. But I also think you can't cut corners when you make a movie musical. You have it demands a certain scale and scope, you know. And so that for me was the solution. It hit me. It's like, no, we're making a 40-minute movie musical, and when you and doing it, in as lavish a way as it needs, and we pay for that by then going and making this very, very kind of down and dirty independent movie for the other 80 minutes, as you say. So that was the balance there. But, the big thing in terms of writing it was, and the question I didn't know the answer to until we actually started to put it together, was how will these two movies work together? Because I think the pitfall always is that you invest in one story and then you're pulled out of it and you start to resent it and you're interrupting something. So I think the critical thing with the movie within the movie, which I basically created in this version, is that in subtle ways it keeps the drama happening between the two men in the cell. It continues to play out through the movie. And I think at a certain point, the audience, that kind of clicks for the audience, and they realize, oh no, it's all one story.
And there's a huge testament to the way that it flows between that and the way that you've thought so specifically about transitioning between the scenes in the cell and the musical numbers. We start to hear some of the instruments or some of the vocals coming through.
Yes.
The lighting starts to already change within the cell before we even visually shift over.
That's right.
And so as you were looking at those transitions for each of the musical numbers, how did you approach that? Because you've done it slightly differently for every single one.
Well, it's true. There's a progression, It starts as a kind of very abrupt thing, here we go. But then toward the middle, in a kind of fever dream, morphine dream, the Spider Woman is now in the cell.
Yeah.
So that that to me was the exciting thing, that you get the audience comfortable, and then you can kind of bend the rules a little, and that was fun to play with. I'm reminded of, one thing that happens in the movie a few times is that Valentín, played by Diego Luna, says, "This is why I hate musicals," or "I hate musicals," and Molina says, "and I pity you." I wanted to make it comfortable for people who aren't huge fans of the genre, because I think, there's a lot in this movie for them too. And my belief is that people secretly want to love musicals and musical numbers, but there's something that makes them a little nervous, or it's uncool and things like that. So you want to show them how to love it. It's a little bit like, I think, what Baz Luhrmann did in Moulin Rouge, which really started the 21st century and started this renewal of movie musicals. But he had this idea, I think, that if people are going to sing love songs, they have to giggle first. You have to give them the license to like in the audience, to say, "Oh God, that's ridiculous," and then they're into it and they're giggling, and then suddenly it's like, "Oh, I love this," And I hope something like that can happen here.
Yeah. And with what you were describing about Valentín, initially being abrasive to the idea of musicals,
yes.
and then we see him get to a point where he's like, "No, tell me more. Tell me what happens
Exactly.
next."
Yeah,
and he's completely enthralled. The two characters between him and Molina are so different to each other at the beginning,
yes.
in terms of how they hold their strength and their nerves. For Valentín, it's this stoicism, and for Molina, it's just this non-stop verbose talking. And what was that like, writing the juxtapositions of two very different characters?
Yeah. Well, it is the essence of the story, isn't it? That these two people, one of them politically active, but who doesn't live in the world of emotions or dreams, and the other who only lives there and has no political interest at all. I think Puig's basic idea, which is what's made this so durable across 5 decades is that you get to watch these polar opposites, because all the rest of the world has been stripped away, start to see each other as individuals and change each other so that they each move into the other's position by the end to a degree. I think, people sometimes ask, what do you want people to take away from in this movie? I do think one thing is we live in a world now of polar opposites, right? And if you can just strip away labels and all ways in which people identify themselves and just start to see them as people, there is this growth that's possible. But to your point, in terms of the stoicism versus the verbosity and all that stuff, that was what was so fun about the prison part of the movie. We went down to Montevideo in Uruguay, and we rehearsed a play. It's a 2-man play, most of that in the prison cell. So we got to really track that, Diego and Tonatiu and I, across the entire movie. There was this wonderful thing where a scene after they make love, where I woke up the day before we were shooting. We'd rehearsed it. It was lovely, and I was like, what you actors have done, we moved beyond this scene. I wrote this scene, and I don't think it makes sense anymore. I think the characters are past that. And as soon as I said it, they both said, yeah, you're right. So I've never had that kind of a luxury in a movie, kind of to be living the edit almost in real time.
No, it's amazing. And also in the way that you've shot everything in the scenes within the cell, it never feels claustrophobic. It doesn't feel like we're stuck in this confined space because of the way that you found to move around, or even just, the decorations that Molina brings in, like
Right.
giving this real light. And, like we were talking about before, some of the lighting design that starts to come into play
Yes,
at certain
yeah.
moments. How did you set about choreographing and blocking everything when so much of the movie is in one singular space?
Right. I set about it by working with Tobias Schliessler, our DP, whom I've worked with on Dreamgirls, Beauty and the Beast, countless movies, who has this special background that makes it. He came out of documentaries, and he made movies like Friday Night Lights, and he's done musicals. So he is the perfect person to integrate these two worlds. But yeah, it was rehearsing, and then the actors generously on weekends would come in, and I show it to Tobias, and we'd work things out, maybe reblock things, but that was absolutely what we had in mind, that we can't repeat ourselves visually. And also, as you say, by the time these two men are making love, there's a romanticism from the Hollywood movie that's made its way into the prison cell.
Yeah. And you were saying before that they ultimately come to see one another very differently by the end of the movie, but it also feels like one of the gifts that they give each other is the ability to see themselves through the other's eyes.
That's right.
And I thought that was a really beautiful thing to explore, and was just curious about, your impression about the way that also opens them up a lot.
Yes, and that's where the movie within the movie is key, because Molina places both himself and Valentín into the movie. And at a certain point, Valentín starts to identify with what Armando's going through, which I find that switch when he opens himself up to that, up to Molina's obsession, to be very moving,
And to your point as well, the musical that we see in the film is all through Molina's perspective and
Correct.
lens. How did the idea of telling a musical through a specific character's imagination shape the way that you wanted to film it and capture it?
Well, I love musicals of that period. We're talking about the Golden Age. We're talking about the Freed Unit, but not only them, but the MGM movies really of the 40s into the late 50s. But frankly, usually once you've seen them once or twice, you really, it's hard to endure the entire film. The plots are often pretty silly, and so for me, I thought, I'm going to make what I want out of most of those movies, which is the highlights. The most dramatic parts, the funniest parts, and then the most spectacular musical parts. So I think Molina's 40-minute version is kind of what I'd love to do to a lot of other musicals that I love, But there's one point in the movie where Valentín says, "Why do I get the feeling you're making all this up?" And Molina says, "I wouldn't put it past me." And there is there is a sense that he so lives inside this movie, and he's told it so many times, that he himself has lost a little sight of what's real there and what he's bringing to it, and which of course was helpful dramatically too, because as you're connecting those two stories.
It also feels like it must shape the way that we see Aurora, and the
Right.
Spider-Woman played by Jennifer Lopez, because particularly with Aurora, Molina has this adoration for her and, describes the fact that they almost want to be her.
Yes.
And so how did that shape the way that you wanted to kind of lens her? Because even the first time we ever see her on screen, it's from behind before we
Yes.
even see her face, so it's just
That's
the
right.
aura.
That's absolutely right. And it was something Jennifer Lopez kind of was onto the minute she read the script in our first conversation. Aurora really is an idealized version for Molina of Molina. And her inability to love matches Molina's. So that idea of, in Jennifer's performance, that she connect to some of the moments and things that Molina is going through, that I find a layer that she that is very interesting and that she really embraced.
And even just as Aurora opens up within the musical
Yes.
to find more of her romantic self, you've really changed the look and the feel of the character. Like the shapes and the silhouettes become much softer and looser.
That's
All of
right.
a sudden she's
Her
wearing her hair down.
Her hair comes down.
How did you come up with those ideas?
Yeah. Well, it's not just me, obviously. There's
Yeah.
a wonderful team here, starting with Colleen Atwood. I mean, and her associate, Christine Cantella. Just the brilliance of Colleen. I remember being on the set of Chicago, and Rob Marshall, we were shooting Razzle Dazzle, and no one had seen the costume, except for him, I think, that Richard Gere was going to wear. And I was like, oh, that's interesting that he's a sort of, circus master. He said, he's a Colleen Atwood circus master, And that's exactly it. I mean, her take on, she kind of references some classic silhouettes, classic costumes from Hollywood history, but her take on it is so specific, And I think that was essential. One thing, we didn't want to exactly ape a 1950s Hollywood musical. In other words, the style is the essence of it, right? And I can talk about the way we shot the numbers and things like that, but also I thought it was important not to be so slavish in our imitation, because I do think that then kind of puts a box around it and makes it remote, So we were hoping, and Colleen and her costumes, getting the essence of something, but also giving it just a flavor of something that makes it connect to a more contemporary audience.
And there's even mention of the musical itself being in Technicolor.
Yes.
And the script even describes the way that certain colors like reds and greens are
Yes,
really
right.
vibrant and
Yes.
effervescent. And we see that in the way that you've created it on screen. And how did the idea of Technicolor really influence the entire color palette and scope of all those numbers?
Well, it's the difference between that and the grays and the real almost black and white nature of the life in the prison, which then, as you say, becomes more golden as the men connect to each other. But an interesting thing happened, because when we were planning the movie, Tobias and I thought, well, we're going to create this Technicolor world, but we're going to give it a slight grain that those movies had, with the lenses that they had and everything, maybe a certain softness, And then when we put it together, it felt like, no, this is Molina's version of it, so it should be the greatest 4K, restoration of this movie. So we sort of pulled back on that idea, made it hyper clear, hyper vivid, Again, maybe less accurate to the period, but to me more useful in telling the story that we're telling, which is what Molina sees in those movies.
And with it being Molina's vision as well, there's certain little details that carry over visually
Yes, yeah.
from the cell life into that. I keep thinking about the red scarf
Yes.
that's in the musical numbers as
That's
a prop,
right.
and also between the two men, that's an object that plays a lot of prominence. How did you find those little details that you wanted to carry through to both worlds?
Yes, can I tell you, the red scarf is the one prop costume that I asked for, and I have it. And I'm going to wear it to the premiere tomorrow night.
Love that.
Yeah. I mean, it means so much, because it's something that it's Armando's red scarf in the movie, which he gives to Aurora, and then when she drives him away, it's all that she has left of him, right? And so Molina, the fan, and also somebody who knows his way around fashion, has recreated that prop. And when he went to prison, he took it with him, and gives it to Valentín at the end. And then it has this special meaning in the very last scene in the movie. So that kind of stuff, being able to take a physical object from a fantasy world and put it into reality. When I was writing and thought of stuff like that, it got very exciting.
Yeah. And in ways that you kind of transport Valentín into the story differently, there's a moment where he describes how he just keeps seeing his real-life girlfriend, Marta.
Yes.
And so you have a scene in the cell where we see Marta appear directly above his bed where he's laying. And then at the same time, we see the musical version with Jennifer Lopez.
That's right.
And what was the difference in terms of coming up with the scope of a musical number that literally straddles both worlds at the same time?
No, it's true. That is the turning point, one of the big turning points in the movie, that at a low point emotionally, Molina convinces Valentín, close your eyes, imagine, enter your imagination. And the fact that he does it while Molina is in his imagination with Aurora, who of course is him. So he would like to be the person, and he has been the person tending to Valentín. But in the movie, Aurora is tending to Armando, and then Valentín imagines the woman he loves tending to him. So it's everyone living in different worlds at that moment. It's really one of my favorite things in the film.
And with the sound of the musical numbers, I know that you tend to like pre-recording the tracks and then also having the performers sing live on set so that you can kind of pull from both spaces.
Yes.
How did that really form all of the musical numbers and the sound design for you?
Well, it's interesting. It is always good to combine those two approaches. But here, in many of the numbers, we are duplicating the Hollywood style, which was pre-record and not sing, But in this case, we knew the performances are so emotional, so that, for example, Jennifer singing "Kiss of the Spider Woman," the title number, that was something. Oh my God! The day that she pre-recorded that with John Kander there, and we were all so blown away. But then on the set, she would do it again and again, and it was really one of those pinch me days.
Yeah. And the way that she's performing as the Spider-Woman versus the musical numbers as Aurora, there's such a clear difference in terms of not just the visual style, but the sound. I keep thinking about the S sounds that are really just held throughout that one number.
Yes.
How did you work with her to really formulate that?
Well, I mean, she worked so hard before I even got there, and she was so deeply immersed in all of this. But then with her and Stevie Mackey, her wonderful music guru, and Matt Sullivan, our whole team, Sam Davis, we really then took everything she was up to and started to hone that into the specifics of every note, every line. And as I said, when we actually came to record it, John Kander was there. And so having this, my God, a moment when he sort of sits at the piano and remembers how he first came up with this tune while she's sitting there, and little insights, that was remarkable.
And in the way that you film the musical numbers on set, it's very much, filming with a wide frame and filming in one take, so you kind of really see that, but then also getting the emotional cadence of the close-up and being able to punch into that at certain moments. And I've heard you describe how the way that Fred Astaire described that there shouldn't be the audience feeling like there's trickery, they should really see the entire body in movement. When did you realize that that was going to very much inspire the way that you were filming the scenes?
Right from the start, and it informed all of our choreography meetings. We had 2 months of those before anyone was there. I always think choreography is the last step of writing, really, because I can conceptualize a scene and write it in the script, but then again, we're sitting there and turning that into beats and then steps, right? Steps come last, the way the dialogue comes last when you're writing. It really is conceptual. That's the important work. But what was interesting here was that it's not just the fact that you shoot it all in as many unbroken takes and as wide a shot as possible, because often it can be wide and then and then Jennifer will come close to the camera, and it turns into a close-up in the same moment. But there's also a structure to these classic numbers that people who made these movies, Minnelli and Charles Walters, they just knew in their bones, but we had to kind of study and relearn because it doesn't exist anymore. And one of them is, if you look at a Sid Charisse number, often she is the center of the number, surrounded by great dancers. But you'll find that she tends to, there'll be a tableau, then it's all movement, and then another tableau, each tableau being different. And I think a number like Give Me Love in this movie is the perfect example of that, where that was, we kind of realized the essence of how those numbers were built, especially the big production numbers.
Yeah. And there's a beautiful musical number towards the end of the film, and it's very much Molina fully becoming comfortable with themselves and becoming a version of Aurora, but it's Molina this time instead of needing to project into someone else.
That's right.
And I love that transition that we see on screen with the hair and the makeup and the costume change. How did you conceptualize all of that?
Well, sometimes when you write things, you're writing description in the script, and some of your favorite lines are just there that only someone who reads it will ever get. But not to give too much away, but at the end, he is killed and he's lying on the sidewalk in a very, very grim environment, and the description is dying in a Sidney Lumet movie is not what he had in mind. So instead he takes this last moment to do what he's spent his whole life doing, sort of, throw himself into a fantasy. But what I loved is that in his fantasy, if he only has moments to live, why not be the version of yourself that you've always wanted to be, So that was what I thought was so powerful there. And, there's nothing in a Hollywood movie like a good makeover scene. So we get one of those there.
And when Melina's released towards the end of the film and goes home, I love the production design in the apartment that they share with their mom, because we don't even need to see inside of that bedroom to kind of see the beaded hanging curtain.
Yes.
And no, that's Melina's room.
That's right.
And how did you really want to capture and portray that relationship with their mom? Because it's something that's been talked about for the entire movie.
Yes, yeah. Well, I think it's the love, right? Yeah. The fact that the mother hasn't touched that room. He's been in prison for 3 years, and she's waiting every day for him to come back. So I do think it's the fact that he was lucky enough to have a mother who raised him on her own, that completely accepted who he was in a time and in a culture where that wasn't so common. And I think that's what we were able to convey there.
And with all of Molina's romanticism, in The Cell, to Valentín, he describes a relationship that he has that's very clearly one-sided adoration, and he gets the opportunity to confront that partner and basically say, you never returned any of the feelings that I was giving you, and you never gave me enough, and it wasn't okay the way that you were treating me in this, because you just wanted to keep me just enough at arm's length so that you could get what you needed. And I love the emotion in that scene. What was that like, filming that with Tonatiuh?
Oh, it was so wonderful. It was, and it's such an important scene, I think, because there are some people who'd say, well, he's out of prison, the movie's reaching its end and things, but for him to find the dignity to actually speak up for himself and to confront somebody who took all of that love but didn't acknowledge it, much less reciprocate it, I think that's a scene that speaks very powerfully to a lot of gay men.
And in working with Tonatiuh on the role of Molina, one of the things that they do that's so phenomenal as a performer is just all of these tiny micro expressions of emotion. And there's so many of them. And, I noticed how intimately you filmed his performance. Was that something that you always had in mind, or did you kind of find yourself leaning even more into it once you saw that performance?
Absolutely. It was prompted by what I was seeing. And I have to say, we came upon Tonatiuh, he self-taped an audition. And you could see immediately that there was, it's almost a cruel thing to say, because there are wonderful actors who can hit every mark, and yet they're not blessed with the face and the eyes to really make that sing on camera. And that's the thing that thrilled me when I saw him. Even in a kind of wide shot, there was a sense that this was a face that you could just spend 2 hours with and fall into, you know. And there was no question once we started shooting that's what he's just effortlessly kind of expressive, you know.
And it brings so much into the relationship that develops between Molina and Valentín throughout the film. As you were working on the script, how did you find the pacing of their relationship and the way that they kind of gradually let each other into their worlds and they gradually transform into these different versions of themselves?
Yeah. No, I think this is the first time an adaptation has presented this as a love story, really, which is true to the novel. So for me, it was about the structure of a love story. It was the structure of love stories is all about what is the hurdle that they have to overcome, you know? So I think when you have that in mind and you see these little tiny movements toward each other, toward overcoming their biases about each other, and then these big moments, basically they're elemental, you know, they are, each one of them is you know, physically reduced to a very vulnerable state, and to watch them, especially Molina, who is the caregiver, take care of each other, you know, I think that's when you can really believe. And I must say, I have to talk about Diego Luna because he was so invested, and I think he had the toughest job in a way, because he had to make you believe that this character was not just agreeing to the kiss of the title and the lovemaking, but actually had fallen in love, you know, and he had to really explain that to people. And so to watch him bring, you know, imbue even those early scenes when he has no interest in them, but you can see there's an acute kind of kindness to him and curiosity that then gets triggered as he kind of relaxes into who Molina is.
Yeah. And even to your point about the romanticism of the story, at the same time, you know, there's this very weighty and very heavy political backdrop to the story.
Yes.
And it also never shies away from the brutality that people
Right.
are experiencing, you know, within this incarcerated system.
Yes.
You know, if we see a character being brought back to a cell and we see their feet not touching the ground because they have to be carried, we don't have to see the torture
Yes.
to know the level to which it's taken place.
That's right.
And how did you want to capture that side of the story?
Well, I think it's crucial, you know, because I do think it is the thing that drives these two men together, because they could die at any time. People die here. And at one point, I think Valentín says, you survive in a place where no one's meant to leave alive, and that's basically true. So, and the specific cruelty, also the kind of psychological cruelty that, you know, in research we discovered happens in these prisons, where there are moments of kindness and they're let out into the yard and they're given food and they're always kept off balance, you know, and that is a thing that is so destabilizing that also allows for this kind of vulnerability to emerge.
Well, I really, really, really loved the film, and I think you've done such a beautiful job in both the writing and the directing of it. So thank you so much,
Well,
Bill.
thank you for these wonderful questions.